Hey there, it's Jaime Alejandro, and this is the Arts Calling podcast, the place where I interview hardworking independent creatives in the literary, visual, and performing arts. Before we get the show on the road, I want to throw in a quick reminder. Please do me a favor and stop by the weekly shout-out links in the episode description. This is an amazing opportunity to discover your favorite independent artist, whether it's a new novel, a new podcast, a new show, anything and everything. The sky's the limit. I'm throwing in there friends of the show, Arts Calling guests, and obviously independent projects that we're working on over at the Coalition. There's so much fun stuff, and I hope that you stop by and support independent artists. Just take a good look in there and you will see that there's a whole bunch of amazing people doing phenomenal things in the fringes, the independent way, the DIY route, and they're doing a phenomenal job. Now, today I'm delighted to be Arts Calling Georgia Jeffries. She is a writer of Emmy Award-winning drama and critically acclaimed noir fiction, honored with multiple Writers Guild Awards, Golden Globes, and the Humanitas Prize. Her work in film has been praised by the Los Angeles Times as standing ovation television. The Los Angeles Review of Books described her short stories in the national anthologies Odd Partners and The Last Resort as firecracker tales and domestic tragedy brilliantly segueing into comic farce. She has also written biographical profiles for HuffPost and UC Press, including The Last Gun of Tiburcio Vázquez, which can be viewed on the KCET TV website Artbound. Born in the Illinois heartland, she worked as a journalist for American Film before writing and producing groundbreaking female-driven dramas, Cagney and Lacey, China Beach, and Sisters. Her screenwriting career has been distinguished by extensive field research, from patrolling the mean streets of Rampart with the LAPD to crashing a Vegas bounty hunters convention to reporting from a Walter Reed Army Hospital surgical bay. Each investigation the basis for one of her many docudramas and series pilots for CBS, ABC, NBC, HBO, and Showtime. A cum laude UCLA graduate, Jeffries is a professor at USC's School of Cinematic Arts, where she created the first undergraduate screenwriting thesis program at an American university. Folks, I think you're going to have a wonderful time. Georgia and I had a phenomenal conversation, and of course, the focal point being her latest novel, The Younger Girl, available October 22nd from Mission Point Press. I was so delighted to have this conversation, a masterclass of storytelling from Georgia, and I hope you join us. So without further delay, let's give Georgia a call. Hi, Georgia. Good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Jaime. A pleasure to speak with you today. I'm good. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I'm really excited to get a chance to talk to you today. It's going to be a wonderful chat. Of course, we're going to be talking about The Younger Girl, which is your latest work that's coming out very, very shortly. But I first want to get a sense of where you come from in your creative journey. But maybe we could go back in time just a little bit and get a sense of how your story began as a storyteller. Of course, you're an award-winning storyteller across various mediums, television, noir fiction, and you're a professor as well. There's so much, so many directions to take. But maybe we could go back as far as I could possibly look up, which was growing up as an only child in the Midwest.
Yes.
What was that like? What do you remember about that time?
I remember a lot of alone time, which I think in retrospect is always good for a writer. I think I was very comfortable in my imaginary world. And I actually, as I have said to some friends, my toughest class in school was recess. And this is true, because from a very early age, I really enjoyed playing with my toys, and I especially like playing with cars. I enjoyed playing with cars, now that I think about it, toy cars, a lot more than dolls, because I like to work at fast speeds with the cars, which is interesting. I'm sharing this with you, Jaime, for the first time as I think back in retrospect. But I did really enjoy making up stories. And because I was an only child, and because my mother wanted me to stay home longer than going to kindergarten, and I had learned to read early and learned letters, et cetera, I did not actually start school until the age of 6. And so, I was well prepared for the academics because my mother had worked with me on that, certainly. But really, my playmate was my mother. And so, and then about 2 years into school, I met my best friend, still one of my best friends, actually from grade school. Yes, in fact, I just saw him a couple weeks ago when we were back in Illinois doing some social media preparation for the historical locations to post for my novel. And he is still a dear friend. He was actually a brother as much as a sister. I mean, as I didn't have a sister, so he was like a brother for me, and we were both only children.
Mm. Yeah, there's a
We
special
were both
bond
only
there.
children.
You kind of
There's a special bond there.
yeah. I
Yes,
I have an
that's so
only child
true.
as well, so I feel like I kind of start to see those patterns happening too. But it's a beautiful thing because you have some found family and some great opportunities to meet like-minded people and things like that. Now with
It's extended family.
yeah,
Extended family. It
yeah.
truly is. Yes.
So, I read somewhere that you're a big fan of the Twilight Zone, and I'm
Oh,
curious.
yes.
That show has to get a nod every single chance I get here on the podcast. But aside from that show, what made you get lost in story as a child? What were some other shows or maybe books that you read that left an impression on you at the time?
I loved biographies. And there were biographies that were written for a child's point of view. And they were always about American heroes or heroines, but they were written from the point of view of the hero or heroine's childhood. So, for instance, I would read about Francis Marion, Swamp Fox. He happened to be a revolutionary hero. And so the children's author, the author of the children's books, would detail the story of this pre hero through childhood and adolescence to inspire the child reader. Um, and then I could see that all these seeds of greatness and triumph and heroism really were set in motion during that person's childhood. So I read it. It's interesting because I read as many uh, books, biographies about boys as I did about girls because I was always interested in the biggest possible picture. And what I love most about these books was that it showed me the importance of, I will use this word now, it's a very 21st century word in terms of our creative work, agency. Agency. So, whatever challenges, losses, griefs, these later heroes and very accomplished Americans experienced as children, they had the stamina and the resilience to overcome them. There was also a series at the time that was repeated from, I think, many decades before. It's a series called the Boxcar Children that I came across in the library. And it was also a story of children, it's story of children who were orphaned and two brothers, two sisters who had to make their way in the world on their own. So I guess that sense of being an only child, sometimes a lonely child, uh, and knowing that I had I had the power to create. I would never have thought in these intellectual terms at the time, but I had the power to create a kind of destiny or life for myself, in which I guess I would say I was the protagonist in the story.
Mm,
The best way to
right.
put it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And there seems to be a tremendous through line in this idea of the past being interested in sort of deconstructing how those initial origin stories and experiences start shaping a human being. And from what I gather, it
Yeah.
seems to have you have taken that into your professional life as a storyteller across so many different mediums, and I'm curious how that came to be such a prominent part of your artistic perspective. Because from what I gather, you've used that sort of approach of looking into people's lives, real life, and try to sort of bring that into narrative. Is that something I'm getting wrong?
No, you're getting it absolutely right. And so I guess I would say, well, I've always had an eager, natural curiosity. I've always asked a lot of questions, both in school and also of my family, frankly. I learned, well, the subject of my book, I didn't learn really about until I was about 9 years old, and I happened to discover these family secrets packed away in the photo albums. But even before that, I asked my parents a lot of questions about their childhood. I guess you say I was perhaps naturally an early investigator, of mysteries. And my mother was also an only child, and both of my parents had come from hardship in terms of family losses of both of their fathers at a very early age, mothers who had been widowed twice, both, and my father also was a child of divorce. So these were my I guess I would say at an early age, I knew I needed to listen to my parents to help them process uh, a lot of what had been going on in their childhood. They talked to me about it. They talked about the some of the traumas and dramas of their growing up. But I wasn't sitting there as a passive listener. I wanted to know more. I was very, very curious. And this is what I'm about to tell you is very funny, but because I don't know of anybody else who ever went back to their grade school reunion, but actually my grade school in Illinois had a reunion, a class
Oh,
reunion
wow.
some years ago. Oh, wow, exactly. Like, wow,
That's
especially
cool.
when you go back and see people you didn't necessarily want to see again from middle school, right? Part of grade school, but there were some we did want to see. And one of the boys at that event said, "Oh, Georgia, I remember you. You're the one that was always arguing with the teachers." And I said, "Oh, I never experienced myself arguing with the teachers. I loved our teachers and I always wanted to know more. I do remember wanting to be a dialogue with the teachers and asking a lot of questions. So it's all from perspective, isn't it? And it's all from point of view. And of course, as storytellers, that's our superpower, the point of view. And I use the word superpower because I'm a professor, and so many of my BFA and MFA students are working on screenplays. And of course, in this era, they are thinking in terms of superpowers for some of their characters. And I think, yeah, the superpower really is the perspective and the point of view. And that is what is most freeing for us as storytellers, as opposed to ourselves being so formed by society's expectations in terms of gender, in terms of class, in terms of um, personal abilities, disabilities, gifts, whatever. There is a huge amount of judgment that crosses cultural lines, in my opinion. So the great desire that I've always had and the opportunity is to get deeper into the spirit and the true essence of my characters, but always with the tension of how outside society is attempting to limit them or categorize them. And of course, I we all speak and write from our experience and being female and starting out in the business when I did, when there was frankly a lot less opportunity for women. Um, that was something that I did feel acutely. Um, and in fact, I wrote an essay for a Writers Guild Foundation anthology of screeners some years ago. The theme of the anthology for the essays was um, what can you share with the readers and aspiring screenwriters in terms of the first time that you would mark how you really engaged successfully with the business. Well, the title of the anthology is The First Time I Got Paid for It, because a lot of people were talking about the first time they got the first paycheck, the first meeting they got at the studio, etc. And the title and the theme of my essay was the first time they told me I wrote like a man. That was as a compliment. And in fact, one of my first meetings, I went into the meeting and the executive was very surprised because he was expecting George Jeffries, not Georgia Jeffries. I had some fun writing that essay. But the point is, I think it's crucial for all of us who want to be really true to our aspirations and our greatest, I guess, humanistic goals as writers, to move beyond all those limitations and judgments. You know, Eleanor Roosevelt said, "You can't feel inferior without contributing to whatever other person's judgment is of you." So I'm a great believer in having faith and taking those steps forward, no matter how difficult they may be.
Wow, this is there's so many things that hopefully we can circle back to in terms of the early days of screenwriting for you, because there's so much to mine there and talk about. But I would like to maybe take this opportunity to segue into Joanna's perspective, the protagonist of this latest novel that you're bringing out into the world. Can you set the stage for Joanna's situation and maybe give us a sense of where she's coming from? Because I think there's maybe some parallels here with some of Joanna's own journey, and maybe you could give us a bit about where we find her, how we meet her, and sort of what the circumstances are of the younger girl, which is the name of the novel.
When you say how we meet her, are you talking about the very first chapter?
Yeah, Miss Inland Empire, and we get to discover her as one thing, but then we get to see various facets of her.
Yes, the title of the first chapter. Yes, and do you know what the Inland Empire is? Have you ever heard of
I believe
the
it's Inland
Empire?
California, right?
It's yes, it's actually south of Riverside, and it's primarily the desert area of and it's not a it's a colloquial term to refer to the desert area. And there are some very well-known cities in that area: Palm Springs, Palm Desert, et cetera, and down to really almost to the Mojave. The first time I ever heard the expression Inland Empire was really not until I was in college. I'd never heard of it because I was raised in Illinois and then later in the Bay Area of California. But I was fascinated by the name. And frankly, that title of that chapter is a metaphor. Inland Empire is from a writer's point of view, the richness of, what the stories you want to tell. But in this chapter, it opens at a teenage beauty contest, and Joanna has won that contest, and her parents are there, and they're very proud of her and cheering for her. And then in the middle of all of that, that teenage glory and success, her father's had one too many drinks again, and knocks over a table, and her mother, who has heart issues, quickly stands up to try to fix everything, put everything in order. The show goes on, and then later that evening, they are at home celebrating with her trophy. They're having a late night supper. And Joanna is so happy and so pleased that her parents are not arguing, and that they seem to be at peace that night, instead of dealing with their own seriously troubled marriage. And then we cut into past memories of different drunken nights when her father was drunk, and her mother and her father were fighting and threatening to kill one another, and actually pulling a knife from the drawer. And so on that particular night, because her parents were happy at her success, they weren't threatening one another. And so she knew in that moment, as long as she continued to succeed and perform and calm them through their anxieties, then all will be well in the family. And then there is a twist and a turn at the end of that chapter, which we will not go into because we want the reader to keep reading. And for many of us who have lived with family members who are dealing with addictions and self-medicating through their own life traumas and needs, I think this might resonate.
Absolutely. And I do think one of the great victories of the first half of the book is your ability to give us a sense of the inherited grief that is just palpable. Like the tension is just ridiculous. And I think in terms of perspective, that is as she sees it and as she's lived through this grief and pain that is just passed down to her. And I just love that it was so quickly set up as an enemy that is just greater than mom and dad, but rather something that has been going on for much longer. And I really enjoyed those little injections of trauma, if you will, that kind of kept piling in. Not to be too morbid or like
No,
evil
but
about
every
it, but
family has them.
yeah,
We every family, generation by generation, it is carried on in some way or form, but not always is it looked at, and not always is it dissected, and certainly not always is it acknowledged.
yeah. And of course, as we move further into the story, we get to learn a little bit more about her father, Junior Owen, who is on this
Yeah.
quest to set things right in his own way. And there's just so much that is up against the two of them. Maybe I don't mean to pry, but I'm just curious because this is a family story, because there is from what I gather, inspiration from oral histories of your personal experiences and some things that happened in your family. Can you share a bit about how that took place and sort of where some divergences might have come in, where you said this is my family story in a way, but what kind of led you to say now we go on to create fiction from these embers of reality?
Yes, it is very much a complex story of oral history, um, many quotes from actual court transcripts regarding the tragedy of my aunt, my father's much older half sister, um, and of course there are scenes that are really quite direct out of my father's and my experience, frankly, um, and I needed to go deeper into the power of the generational power of the story. Um, and so many of the characters that were later introduced, such as Lottie, and we will just call her a kind of spiritual guide for Joanna later on, was actually inspired by some oral history that I had taken from the then aged daughter of the owner of the Log Cabin restaurant, which is where my aunt was last seen before she was killed. My father and I went back to Illinois in 1996, and as I mentioned in the author's statement, as well as actually dramatizing to a point in the book, my father died soon after we went back for that family visit, not in the way that I had written as fiction in the book. He did not die in Illinois. He died several months later in California. But I was the great gift of my father, the great legacy that he shared with me, and there were many, because he was a very sensitive spirit. So in a sense, that I think all of many artists have that sensitivity in terms of how they approach lives and stories and the act of listening. But he agreed to walk me through the last, his childhood, where he lived, some of the things that he experienced. And he actually walked me through the last night of my aunt's life, as he knew it based on the newspaper thing. So he was willing to meet that grief head on and share that with me. And then I came across, not I came across, I very actively sought out oral histories when we were back there. And by the way, the character of the undertaker was based on a true individual who was actually the center of connecting me with so many people. Oh yes, he was. And he had his own tragic end several years later, but we won't go into that now. But he was very, very helpful to me. And one person he connected me to was the daughter of the owner of the log cabin restaurant, which is still there, by the way, and which I visited a mere 2 weeks ago. And it was she, the basis for the character of Lottie, who told me about the necklace that my Aunt Aldine had given her as a child, that she still had at the time that I was talking to her, that she still cherished. And that opened up a whole new arena of understanding of who my aunt was, because I think I referred to her at one point as a diamond with many facets. Well, that's true for all of us as human beings. But so I had my uncle's point of view. I had several older cousins' points of view, some positive, some negative. I had my father's point of view. And so I was dealing with all of those POVs and creating my own with all of that information. So even though the character of Lottie is fictional, she was inspired by a person that I talked to who knew my aunt, and shared some essential information about her character to me.
Right, right. And I love this idea of just being buried in perspective and sort of trimming everything down, distilling in a way that creates form. But I'm curious because it seems like an insurmountable task. You have so many stakeholders of the narrative, you have so many people who are sort of giving you different angles and directions. But for you, do you recall moments during your research when you found signposts or pillars for your fiction, much like, the what you were just telling me here? Or does it, what were some clues that allowed you to start creating a shape for the fiction that you wanted to tell?
Yes. Well, at the very, very beginning, there were dreams. I reference dreams. And we're intuitive as artists. We're intuitive, and those dreams actually helped to launch a certain approach to the novel. I'll be very clear about that. And then, as actually, his name was Jerry Duffy, the mortician who was at the center of connecting me to so many people in Pontiac, old and young. I'll give you another character. The character of Marcus was inspired by a gentleman that I met there. He would have been a peer of my aunt's, and he was particularly important because of the perspective he gave me of the time of growing up there, and also because the gentleman who inspired that character is long past now, but he was a person of color, and one of the prosecutors of Ashley Bentley, who was the person who was convicted of manslaughter, of killing my aunt, my father's sister. One of the prosecutors was a person of color. And in 1934 in Illinois, that was highly, highly unusual. And that person had long passed, unfortunately, although he was highly respected in the community. And I wanted to use that sense of an outsider, a person perceived as an outsider who was constantly proving himself in the larger conservative cultural community, was in fact a harbinger of, or at least, justice that needed to be served for my aunt, who I also believe in a certain way, even though she was a descendant of certain esteemed ancestors in that community, I believe she was an outsider. I think she had a strong sense of not, well, she was, of really wanting to go far beyond that smaller community, and also experiencing, well, yeah, she was, to use Old Testament terms, she was sinned against, and there are references to traditional Christian biblical education in the book, because actually both of my grandmothers were very, very strong women of Christian faith. So yeah, there was injustice, yeah, and there were sins. And if you consider murder a sin, and I do, yes, a sin was committed, right?
Yeah.
So justice must be found in some way. And justice is not always served, but I do believe there is always the opportunity for redemption.
Absolutely. There are, strong biblical undercurrents, for the story and in terms of the way it's framed. But I think one of the really effective things that you work with here is as you were saying, the outsider perspective, and how for, I think it's just so great that it allows you to really expand the setting. It felt so vivid and real because that hierarchy of outsiders versus, the established is so clearly established that it just sells the setting a lot more. I mean, what were the considerations for setting and finding the right, the historical documents, the vernacular, getting a lot of those things right? Because a lot of that, it was just going back and trying to get that right, I imagine.
Well, the vernacular was something I grew up with,
Ah,
because all of my my elders in Illinois as a
mm,
child, they had all been raised in farming communities. So I grew up with that vernacular, and it's actually quite poetic in certain ways. So I just tapped into that. Um, and the other question was about the research. That research was undertaken over a period of about 15 years. There were 3 separate trips to Illinois. The first was with my father. The second was probably not until about almost 10 years later. My husband and I went back and started going through some of the transcripts. A librarian in my very first visit with my father in 96 had been very helpful, and I was able to do certain things on the internet, but I had to get back into those files in the back of the courthouse, and took many, many copies. So much reading through those transcripts, and also not just of the trial in Illinois, 2 trials, because there were 2 criminal trials. First against the embezzler, uh, who um, who had stolen my aunt's inheritance money before she came of age, at the age of 18. And then the later criminal trial against the man who was responsible for her death. So I had to go through all of those trials. And let me tell you, it was a maze. It was a maze in the beginning. It was absolutely confounding, because my father had one history, I was reading other histories, etc. As you know, without giving away anything, my father implicated a member of our own family in her death. And so I had to sort through so much. And then I had to my own the data, through the evidence, and discerning what I thought were the strongest elements of truth through the oral histories. So it was an ongoing journey. And Jaime, you know, I was writing this novel in between writing 2 other novels and teaching full time. I'm a tenured professor at USC School of Cinema, and so it was on again, off again. And there would be months where absolutely no work was done on the book, and then so it was primarily summers that I could focus on it, or if I had a sabbatical, and I would come back to it. But I'll tell you, the greatest joy for me was when I could put aside this other work, because I'd had a novel deal for well, it was, but the novel was supposed to be published in 2021 during the pandemic, and then the Los Angeles imprint Adaptive Books had been dissolved. But that's where I was spending a good probably 4 years completing that book, being paid for that book. And of course, we must start with, nobody was paying me to write this book early on. I was doing all of this on my own time. We know how we work as writers and artists, right? But what maintained my strong, I guess, this confidence, the artistic confidence in what I was writing, was being able to write the character of Aldine. Because without giving away too much, we know that the novel deals with both third person, the story of Joanna and Owen, daughter and father, and then we intercut the first person point of view of his sister from the age of 15 to 20 in a very specific way. And so when I did not have the time to look at the larger, complex structure of the novel, what I was able to do was to write Aldine's point of view. I could come home from classes or just tap into it on the weekend. So I would be writing her point of view in those segments, and they were never in sequence, never in sequence. It would just be like, as we do when we're writers and artists, we kind of channel a character, and it would come through there, and just trust I will find will when the time is right.
I'm actually glad that you brought up the diaries and that first person perspective, because I was so curious how, for one, you know, how you're able to manage all of that information and all of the research on a practical level. Like, how do you handle all that? But I think that the flip side of it, as you were saying, is being able to just cut to the emotional core of something. And
Thank you.
that was,
Yes,
that was
yes,
my
yes.
question, is like, how do you balance that? Because I just thought it was such a clever way to give us more of that interiority, and it fits so well with just the amount of information that you get throughout the novel. It really humanizes everything.
Thank you so much. I
Yeah.
really appreciate that was resonated for you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I guess the balance of something like that, you know, I think, as I'm sure as a screenwriter and somebody who's in dramatic writing, I think, is there a responsibility to sort of focus or prioritize the structure part of it versus just an emotional journey? Or is that really not a conversation that you have in terms of balancing out just emotional wandering versus a very rigid kind of structure?
I do believe that there's having been trained in screenwriting, I do believe there is a responsibility. Not all writers would necessarily agree with me on that, but because you know, and I learned so much as a very young screenwriter on a very successful series, Cagney and Lacey. I mean, I came in there really as a magazine journalist, and having only written 2 other scripts, one of them having won a film festival award, Houston Film Festival award, um, that was based on a woman in the military, but it was never actually filmed. But it was that script that the executive producer of Cagney and Lacey hired me from, actually, for my very first episode. I'd never even pitched to a television series before. So that was my film school, working on Cagney and Lacey, because I graduated with a major in history and journalism at UCLA. So my film school was working on my very first series. So yes, I do think there's a responsibility of the writer, from my point of view, to have a cohesive structure. And Joanna and Owen have their own emotional journeys individually and in their relationships. Aldine was the mystery. I had to crack the mystery of this person who was dead and gone and left no written evidence. There was a lot of evidence from the lawyers' offices, the court transcripts, even my paternal grandmother's writings and ledgers of what she maintained for the executor of my aunt's estate before she died. But I kind of so that was the importance of having as much veracity in people's memories of her, but also tapping in really independently from my writer's point of view. And so much of what you read in Aldine's diary was based on the oral histories that I took with other people. I mentioned there's shall we give this away? Yeah, I'll just a little tease here, perhaps, that my paternal grandmother actually constructed a still during the Depression to make alcohol and bottle it and sell it to make extra money for the family.
Oh, goodness.
And according to my dad's memory, yes, if my dad remembered my Aunt Aldine arriving to smash it, she was very, very upset in terms of what would the town think, the town arbiters of right and wrong. So that is an example of my taking a memory of my father and then rewriting it from my aunt's point of view. So, but I think your larger question is also, how much time do we take to balance the, let's say the intellectual structure of the novel, as well as the emotional journeys? And I think it's all about who our target, and I'm going to speak like a screenwriter right now, who our target audience is.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some writers who would perhaps just write from their own Proustian point of view, and it's a beautiful journey, experiencing the language and the visual. I do take the responsibility of creating some lyrical prose as well as some very direct dialogue, because I want to hear the truth, and I think a lot of the truth comes out in conflict and dialogue, and that's what I've learned as a screenwriter. But I always want my audience, whether it's from work I've done on the screen, now of course primarily prose, to walk away with a sense of understanding and hopefully a sense of having been uplifted by some of the insights that they may connect with and use in their own personal lives and family lives to better inform their family relationships. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
I hope that's
that's
helpful.
Spot on, because I think that there has to be a more objective conversation, much like screenwriters and folks in an industry such as yours, that there are so many tools as a screenwriter that you can take into writing a novel and creating something that, that has a little bit more wind behind its sails, if you will. And I wanted to ask you, like, if you could elaborate a little bit more on the kinds of tools in your screenwriting toolkit, if you will, that allowed you to feel more confident as a novelist, as somebody who is, sort of crafting your own story and your own perspective as a novelist.
Well, absolutely, the use of writing scenes, SCENES. I think in scenes. I probably did not always think in scenes until I had become an accomplished screenwriter. But whatever I write now, I think in scenes. And, we live our lives in scenes. And we live our lives in relationship to that argument that we had with someone else, the conflict in that moment. One of my earliest lessons from from mentors on my first TV series was that information is revealed through conflict. Never use exposition to catch up the reader or the audience member. Please, no. Let's make it exciting. What's exciting? Are people walking away from a conversation because of hurt feelings? It's silence. There's also a lot of information that is delivered in silence. And you could say, well, how do you really show that in prose? I mean, of course, writing a screenplay, actors loved the less is more dialogue. And that's something that was one of my great revelations, because I overwrote in my early years as a screenwriter. And it's so freeing to be able to reduce the lines of dialogue, and also to know that people never say what they mean, or very seldom say what they mean.
Yeah.
It's what's buried underneath that line, and that also gives the actors the opportunity for the audience to see what's really going on their faces. Now, can't do that in prose, so I like to keep the pacing accelerated in the dialogue. Let's keep the reader interested, and then in a few moments, I'll have like perhaps a text prose to observe something that's going on, but I also trust the reader to kind of discern, and I don't underestimate the reader. I don't feel that I certainly don't want to explain. That's an intellectual exercise. But what I do need to do, and this is my responsibility, is to write enough clues through those scenes and through the perspectives of the characters, because it's always a puzzle, especially for those of us. I love what Joyce Carol Oates said, and I'm paraphrasing her. She said, in the sense that every story is a crime story, because in certain crimes there are all sorts of crimes. They don't have to be one that people are prosecuted before. They could be emotional abuses of power. But people can be very cruel to one another. Is that a crime? It depends on the consequence, doesn't it? And how one's life is formed by that, and how who perhaps is not fully respected or seen or heard then carries on his or her life. So all these complexities, and I hope I'm not confusing the answer to your question here, but I think the general rules are less is more in terms of dialogue. Use conflict as much as you can. Never use exposition. Trust your audience, and think in terms of dramatic scenes, because we live our lives in scenes. And yes, we have our own relationship with ourselves. And that's something interesting that I want to discuss more.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I've written primarily in third person. This is even my short stories have been in third person. Writing Aldine's journal entry, that's the first time I've written in first person, and I have to say I really enjoyed it. I love it, but I think it's a fine balance. And one of a colleague of mine and a friend and someone who's writing I really respect, Rachel Housel Hall. You know her work, and I just interviewed her actually yesterday for a mystery panel, and she writes a great deal in first person. And I don't know if you've written in first person, Jaime. Have you? Have you written in first person?
Only monologues and soliloquies every now and then. But
well,
not
see,
too much.
and isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
So that's a playwright and a
Yeah.
screenwriter. You know, we write it for the actor.
That's right. That's right.
Write it for the actor. There are stand-ins. Writing first person on the page is really a more intimate experience because we're directly revealed as that character, right?
Right.
And so I would like to do more of that. I'm working on a couple of short stories right now. I mean, and I have another book that is well, it's a Los Angeles noir, and it's also third person, intercutting between past and present, based on a kind of infamous LA Mr. Goodbar case.
Oh.
We can talk more about that, in a year or two.
Sure.
But I think that is also third person for me, and Malinche, which is the title of the book that was going to be published by LA Books, and the history of Malinche, right? This is a contemporary story, but again, Malinche is a metaphor for this young woman in the military who's being used as a scapegoat after a mission in Mexico. So they're all third person, but I want to play more with first person. How about you? Would you like to do more of that?
Well, I've been dabbling in fiction proper for the last 2 years or so, just sort of getting my dipping my toe in those waters. And I think the fascinating thing is, you would think that writing in first person would be easier for a playwright or a screenwriter, but there is something of a completely different alchemy there that I've yet to sort of get right. And I think I'm just going to need a little bit more time to practice that, because it sounds like the tenor of it is completely different. As you were saying, there's a different skill set there.
I believe that for me, it's one that I want to become more adept at, but it is also a more intimate experience for me.
Yeah.
Yes. Because we're used to, as playwright and screenwriter, dealing with actors.
Right.
And so in a sense, they are our beards. You know what I mean by that? They can be, right?
Right.
We could say, whatever we want, they're going to deliver it. And as I've often said to my students, some of the most interesting characters for us to write are the so-called villains. Of course, every character must be multi-dimensional, but so often we put in the villains' mouths what the shadow of ourselves, using that Jungian analysis. I will say that I think one of the great gifts that I gave to myself, and I did this actually when I was writing, I think it was my second screenplay. Actually, it was, second screenplay, which is the first one that I wrote for hire and actually got paid for. I took a dialogue class in an actor's studio to help me.
Oh, great.
With dialogue, and because I was not that far out of college, and I still had a tendency to use academic speak, or to speak in full sentences. People don't speak in full sentences. They speak in fragments, and they interrupt one another constantly. And so that was, and at USC, our students in cinema are required to take acting classes to teach them the power of dialogue. And I had such fun in that acting class because we would just sit across one another in the table. We weren't on a stage. It was all about active listening. And somebody else.
Two interviews at once. Let's go.
Left his phone over there. Hold on. This is my husband's phone. Okay. All right. Honey, but there you go. But that sense of active listening. And it not only helped me with my dialogue, which is one of the favorite things of mine to write right now. It also helps me as I create characters. And actually, it helps every relationship in life, isn't it?
Absolutely.
If you actively listen to another, because So often we're thinking, even before they finish their second sentence, what am I going to say to this? How am I going to respond, especially if there's any tension there? So I think that's really valuable. And I will tell you that when I set screenplays, I always received for characterization and dialogue, but what I needed to learn more about, and I did. And again, my first television series, and also working with the first producer of my first assigned screenplay, which was Nobody's Fool. I worked with a European producer on that, who had actually brought me the idea based on a Times article, was that I needed to learn structure. So that was my big learning curve. And just as important about what to put in is what you leave out. And that's the great value of revising. Revise, revise, revise. And in I teach MFA thesis and BFA thesis, and each of those classes require a year-long commitment for the student, both in television emphasis. They can emphasize on television drama or in features. That means that in a year, you go through a minimum of 3 drafts, a minimum. And also for television, it's a minimum of 2 drafts, probably closer to 3, but also they are required to write story treatments, which are the story outline by scene before they begin their first draft of the thesis, which is due at the end of the first semester. And for the television majors, well, they're all cinema majors, but for those who are doing the thesis emphasis in television drama, they are also required to create a Bible, a series Bible. And you know what a series Bible is?
Right. The works compressed.
The world, the character bios, the projected first 13 episodes, depending on the professor, depending on whether the student is creating a limited series, which might only be 6 to 8 episodes, or whether the student writer is considering more of a conventional series, then it would be 13 episodes. So, and those are all workshopped in the room. They're all workshopped with the other class.
A massive amount of storytelling.
It's a massive amount of storytelling. Yeah, and it's very, very important from a professor's point of view that be a safe room, because these students offer notes to one another, and they bring in different scenes week by week. And then, of course, at the end of the first semester and at the end of, or at least midway through the second semester, all of the notes from and they're small classes. They're very small classes. They vary between probably 8 and 10. So it's an intense workshop.
Yeah. So there's so many directions, and I know I only got you for a couple more minutes, but I have a few more to be mindful of your time here. In particular, about as a I guess as somebody who has done this for a long time, and you're a professor, so you get to see folks at the very beginning of these professional stages. And I'm curious, what kind of elements does somebody need in order to be consistent and to have the longevity in an industry that is notoriously difficult, especially as somebody who puts pen to paper, who writes and writes? What is it? What are some basic elements that would help somebody create longevity?
That's a great question, because it is a marathon. It is a marathon. It's not a short sprint. I mean, if you are invested in a successful career, it is a marathon. I would say stamina. I would say a higher point of view, owning your work as your work first before it becomes the target, and that's a good word, the target of collaboration. Because in screenwriting, of course, we're dealing with many cooks in that kitchen. And first of all, we're dealing with the producer, the production executives, whether they're studio or network, ultimately the director, ultimately the line producer. Many things need to be changed just for budget considerations, right? And then, of course, the actors. And some actors are far more vocal than others. So what do we need to deal in a non-defensive way with all these many voices? Because we've just delivered them the very best that we can do, right? And yet the request is for more changes, always the revisions. So many of these requests are related to the business of the business. It's not always about, is it going to make it better? I had the sense in a number of my television series that only because we had a production deadline did the revisions stop, because everybody has an opinion. But when you know it has to be delivered because you're going to start shooting next Monday and you only have a 28-day shoot, which is one of the cable films that I wrote and executive produced up in Vancouver, then you go with your best in the moment. So that means and my life partner, my husband, can testify to this. That means as much as we may, as sensitive creative artists, may tend to take notes personally, or criticism or judgments. They're always referred to as notes, right? And so the correct response to a note is, that's interesting, as opposed to, no, this is better this way, or yes, I'll fix that right away. You may choose, as a writer, you may choose to change it after you have had time to process what you are leaving or surrendering by taking this new note and recreating. It may be much better. I often talk to my students about the process of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So in other words, we write our thesis, then we get the first notes, and the instinct is, there are many of us in the screen trade and the arts. We tend to be perfectionistic. We want it to be our very best. We're going to fix it. We're going to fix it right now. And then you lose some of the essence and the power of what you began with. So the synthesis, the best draft, is often the third or the fourth, because we are buying time. We are looking at it from a HEIRESS perspective. And there is a gestational period that is very, very important. So when my students graduate, of course, they're sending their work out into the marketplace right away. I always advise them, they're going to get more notes, but then think about revisiting it several months later and then looking at it one more time. So I would say, don't take anything personally. Be a professional. A professional is one, be your own authority. And let's go back to the word author, right? Be your own authority. Have confidence that you creatively can get this. You got this. And you may need, as we often do, all of us, time to go deeper, richer, fuller, before you decide what you're going to take and what you're going to leave. I hope that's helpful.
No, that's remarkable advice. I did want to ask you personally, as an author, as an artist yourself, you've written so much, you've worked so much, and I'd like to know if there are challenges that you feel that you conquered while finishing this novel that you hadn't before. Like,
yes, absolutely. Did I conquer it? That's a strong word. I met it. I met those challenges and I moved through them, Jaime. And it was such an unusual journey because it was stop and start. Whereas as a screenwriter for so many years, I've been used to the firm deadline. Even in the last novel, Melinche, that I wrote for adapted books, there were deadlines. So I was the deadline for this book. When is it going to be finished? When is it ready to go out? And so I guess for me, it was probably the most intimate of all of my writing experiences because it is a family story. And there is so much of it that is based on actual incident. Of course, we all write from our experience. And I think all of my writing has a touch of the autobiographical. But this was very, very specific. And I felt a great responsibility because I did feel it was a family legacy. And at the same time, I really wanted to speak to readers, entertain them, and sell books.
That's right. So one last thing, and I'll let you enjoy your day because you've been very gracious with your time. I tend to ask folks who are guests on the podcast about something that affects them personally to do their best work. I believe in quality of life. I feel like a lot of the time, yes, we want to establish a career that is successful, and you're under tremendous pressures, but what are some things that bring you to center that contribute to your quality of life? It doesn't have to be, related to your profession, but as a human being, how do you create a life well lived for yourself and the people around you?
And I very much appreciate that question, honey. Very much appreciate it. And in doing a little research on your previous work, I know that's a goal.
It was coming.
Years. I'm pleased it is. And I will tell you, that's been a lifelong journey for me because I have tended to be work. There's always work and family and work. That's my life. And you have to balance it always. And I would say it's really probably only been since I've been a professor and I've been very conscious of mentoring other students and knowing that I need to teach them not just about the work, but about how they're going to sustain themselves through the demands of the work, that I had been more conscious of balance in my own life. And I would say that I think it's important to have a spiritual life, and different people define spirituality in different ways. For me, on my best days, it's meditating. For me, always it is nature, getting outside to walk, almost every single day. That helps to put things into perspective, so I can get out of the cerebral mind spin and refresh myself, not just physical energy, but emotionally, mentally, in every way. I think family and friends are essential to us, so that we are human beings first, and creative artists second, although they're very intertwined, and sometimes it's very hard for me to see the difference. But we all have our callings in life. We all have our callings and our sense of when our time is done on earth, what are we leaving behind? What have we experienced? Most of all, what are we carrying away with us, and what are we leaving, for those who follow behind us? And that can be family, readers, audience, whomever. So I'm very conscious of that. And I'm glad that you're conscious of it too. And I hope that you will inspire all of your listeners to be conscious of that.
Well, that is a beautiful, soulful note to wrap it up on. So thank you so much, Georgia. I'm very grateful for your time.
You're welcome.
This has been a phenomenal, quick master class on storytelling. And of course, I want to congratulate you. Yeah, I want to congratulate you for
Thank you.
This wonderful work that you've put out into the world. And I do hope we get to catch up down the road because there's only more to come. There's so much to come. So yeah, let's keep in touch. And again, congratulations. It's a great work.
Thanks so much, Jaime, and thank you for reading it so carefully. They were very thoughtful questions, and I appreciate that very much.
Wonderful. Well, you take care. I'll let you enjoy the rest of your day, and I will be in touch real soon on the internet, okay? Thanks again.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye, Jaime. Thank
Bye.
you.